Namaskara, good evening, and welcome to BIC Streams. Bangalore International Center, or BIC for short, is an inclusive and neutral platform for informed conversations, intellectual dialogue, exchange of ideas, and the arts. Today's session is the visual dichotomy of coloniality, how artists and photographers visually constructed the British Empire. This discussion is between art historian and researcher Ayesha Matthan and Sean Willcock, who's a departmental lecturer in the history of art at the University of Oxford, and is based on Willcock's latest book, Victorian Visions of War and Peace, Aesthetics, Sovereignty, and Violence in the British Empire, a study of how artists and photographers shaped imperial visions of war and peace in the Victorian period. In an era that saw the birth of photography, circa 1839, and the rise of the illustrated press, circa 1842, the British experience of their empire became increasingly defined by the processes and products of image making. Examining moments of military and diplomatic crisis, this book considers how artists and photographers operating in the field helped to define British visions of war and peace. The Victorians increasingly turned to visual spectacle to help them compose imperial sovereignty. The British Empire was thus rendered into a spectacle of peace, from world's fairs to staged diplomatic rituals. Yet, this occurred against a backdrop of incessant colonial war campaigns, which, far from being ignored, were in fact unprecedentedly visible within the cultural forms of Victorian society. Visual media thus shaped the contours of imperial statecraft and established many of the aesthetic and ethical frames within which the colonial violence was confronted. The bios of both our speakers will appear in the chat box, which is at the bottom of his Zoom screen. And through the session, if you have any questions, comments, or observations to share, please feel free to use the Q&A box, which is also at the bottom of his Zoom screen. Ayesha will engage Sean in a conversation after Sean's presentation, and I now hand it over to Sean to begin his presentation.
Thank you very much, and thank you everybody for having me. The invitation. It's lovely to be able to speak to you. I'm just going to try and share my screen now. Is everybody seeing that okay and hearing me all right? Okay, brilliant. So I wanted to think a little bit today about how to account for the emergence of an image like this. And this is from the Illustrated London News, published during the 1862 International Exhibition in South Kensington in London. It shows these fairly well-to-do visitors admiring a rather strange installation. It's an installation of British manufactured weaponry. Now, other scenes in this same supplement depicted visitors like this engaging with works of art. So we're seeing a kind of equivalence being registered here between a military way of seeing and the rather kind of sophisticated viewing practices that have become an increasingly fundamental feature of Victorian culture since at least the celebrated World's Fair of 1851, what was called the Great Exhibition. But this equivalence that we see here between military spectatorship on the one hand and artistic spectatorship on the other was actually quite jarring for some of the British at the time. The military court had been a controversial new addition to the 1862 show, and it had been seen by some as really corrupting the ideals of the Great Exhibition 10 years earlier, which had been famously about promoting peace. So one critic writes, "No wonder the ghost of the 1851 exhibition is so restless. Peace, so loudly invoked in the first exhibition, scarcely expected to see this as a result of it in the second." So what had happened during this short amount of time. You know, the Great Exhibition in 1851 had been called the Temple of Peace by some. Its display of fine art and craft, all of this constituted the so-called arts of peace. But the global events that we see emerging in the years that followed were going to sorely test the geopolitical optimism of the British, which had been sort of instantiated, materialized in that 1851 show. And the reasons for this may sound quite familiar to us actually today. There had been a confrontation with Russia regarding the balance of power in Europe, and this led to Britain entering the Crimean War in 1854. And this was very significant to the British because it was the first major conflict in Europe since the Napoleonic era, many decades earlier. And meanwhile, further east, the outbreak of the Indian uprising, this major insurgency that was motivated, at least in the British mind at the time, by Islamic fanaticism, was launching this bloody challenge against the rule of the East India Company. So we have global violence of this sort, which is really beginning to mock the fairly starry-eyed rhetoric of the 1851 Great Exhibition. And in the decades separating these two exhibitions, we find numerous new modes of visual practice becoming really entrenched in the visual culture of the Victorians. And this occurs in ways that radically alters the Victorian relationship to global warfare. There's this global explosion of amateur and professional photography. This, by the way, is the 1851 Great Exhibition. There's a global explosion of both amateur and professional documentary photography occurring. And we see that as these photographers move from a European theatre of war, you see there on the left with a photograph from the Crimean War, probably the most shocking one to emerge from that war, although it shows no bodies, only cannon. As photographers moved to an Asian theatre of war, however, they grew increasingly comfortable with graphic levels of violence, as seen in this famous photograph from the Indian uprising on the right. And we'll return to this photograph and some of the reasons why there was this increase in violent content in photographs later on in the talk. There was also newspapers, and these newspapers didn't really run photographs, but they were running illustrated reports on international conflict and foreign affairs, which were absolutely unprecedented in their scope and their popularity. And many of these were produced by artists. It was too difficult really at the time to just straightforwardly reproduce photographs. So it was still artists for many decades throughout the 19th century who were contributing to newspapers. And many of these scenes would really romanticize military violence, really romanticize the kind of danger one might find oneself in during warfare. So you've got all of these developments in the sort of culture of the Victorians and the extent to which they're exposed to the global violence going on around them. British culture is really inundated by images of conflict. And so by 1862, the presence of these really quite strange temples of military ordnance, which we find on the military court, actually it's starting to make a certain kind of sense. You know, these preceding years have seen warfare become quite well integrated into middle class, metropolitan spaces of visual consumption, from the gallery wall to the pages of the respectable illustrated press. So the rise of photography and a mass illustrated press, these are just two features. They're important, but they're combining with innovations like telegraphy, railways, steamships, all of these things, these products of the Industrial Revolution, which are radically altering the terms in which global conflict was perceived, both by the British public and those involved in the fighting itself, the combatants. And we see something of this indicated in the painting that I have up here. This is by John Dalbiac-Louard, and it's called A Welcome Arrival. And it shows three British officers during the Crimean War receiving a package of supplies from England. And they're unpacking it in the context of their mess hut, the wall of which is covered with these scenes that have been culled from the Illustrated London News and placed on the wall there. These scenes represent art, they represent theatrical scenes, they represent nature. So there's sort of these reminders of peacetime, actually, for these men at war. But these reminders of peacetime that we see in this imagery go side by side with quite a few images of seafaring vessels. And these pictures of ships really gesture, I think, towards an expanded geographical horizon, and they also possess clear military connotations in the context of the naval battles that were then taking place in the Black Sea. And these officers would have been well aware that a new breed of on-the-spot, as they were called, on-the-spot artists were with them on the Crimean Peninsula, producing popular visual reports for newspapers like the Illustrated London News. This had been founded in 1842, and it doubled its readership from 100 to 200,000 per week during the Crimean campaign. So warfare was good business for these newspapers. The 1850s to 1900 has since been called a golden age of military correspondence. And this is because it sort of combined frequent wars, the so-called small wars of the Victorian era, with minimal official restrictions on journalists and an expanding popular press. And in a critical sense, I think, the illustrated periodicals publishing this kind of imagery were offering actually quite a similar experience to the reading public that the World's Fairs, those international exhibitions I began with, were offering to their visitors. You know, they were both responding to the globalization that we were seeing under modernity by making these ever grander claims to placing the entire world on display. Apologies, I've got the window open. There's a fly buzzing around me. If anyone can see or hear that, there's not much I can do. So the first editor of the Illustrated London News, F.W.N. Bailey, proclaims very proudly to his readers in one of the initial editions, I quote, "Is there peace? Then shall its arts, implements, and manufactures be spread upon the page. The literature, the customs, the dress, nay, the institutions and localities of other lands shall be brought home to you with spirit, with fidelity, and, we hope, with discretion and taste. Is there war? Then shall its seat and actions be laid naked before the eye." So there's this kind of totalizing approach to representing the geopolitical landscape emerging here. And it's an approach that is later distilled by the Graphic, which was founded in 1869, you know, another of these illustrated periodicals, which in response to the imperial bombast, really, that we see at the Indian and Colonial exhibition held in South Kensington in 1886, another one of those sorts of world fairs that really characterizes this period. The newspaper offers its own completest vision of the world by publishing Walter Crane's Imperial Federation map. This is a large color supplement intended as a wall chart for schools. And it functions really as a form of imperial pedagogy. It's showing the British Empire in its global context, replete with these ethnological figures that we see in the borders. And this map, it's got quite a sort of complicated meanings to it, which I won't go into, but this map has since become an icon of high Victorian imperialism, seen in some ways to define the kind of confidence, I suppose, of the British Empire at the peak of its power. But its depiction of a clearly demarcated and unified empire that we see here by painting the map, this sort of imperial pink, I think it really belies the very messy and often bloody realities of Britain's global reach. You know, these borders that we see here, they were ever shifting and they were policed, of course, by violence. So today I want to consider how new forms of visual media that I mentioned were shaping the perception of the violence that was necessary to maintain an empire like this. Paintbrushes and easels, pencils and sketchbooks, cameras and tripods. There was this constellation of visual practices taking place in the field, and they were really shaping the British perceptions of their global role and of their empire. And so too, I think, were these new visual technologies increasingly beginning to shape the perceptions of those peoples the people who were invaded, and having been invaded, were consequently exposed to these image making practices, which would follow in the wake of armies. The writer Rudyard Kipling, the bard of empire, as he was known, wrote a story in 1890 called "The Light That Failed," and in that story, one of the main character is a special artist, as they were called, special correspondent, one of these artists who goes out and sketches war. And in the book, that artist is characterized, or rather the whole pictorial press is characterized as really sort of catering to what was called by Kipling the blind, brutal British public's bestial thirst for blood. Journalism was to modern society what gladiatorial combat had been to the ancient world. They have no arenas now, Kipling wrote, but they must have their special correspondents. So these special correspondents going out to zones of conflict, sketching violence and sending it back for the bestial thirst of the British public, they were fully a part of this new gladiatorial arena, or at least they were making claims to be. In 1901, one of these special artists, working during the Anglo-Boer War, cast a wry eye on a phenomenon that he believed was endemic to the Victorian engagement with war. He claimed that military campaigns were increasingly mediated affairs within which artists and journalists had conspired together to claim a privileged status for themselves. He said that while the artist might sketch his companion, the journalist, in the midst of bursting shells, the journalist would then describe his companion, the artist, sort of committing heroic deeds. So by their own accounts, this artist goes on to say, these adventure-loving journalists are apparently so very heroic, so very much in the thick of battle all the time, that it had rendered military generals all but pointless. For as anybody knows who has studied the records of recent wars, he says, it is almost invariably a special correspondent who leads the troops to victory, or directs great operations, or comes to the rescue of field marshals. So these are the sorts of grand claims being made by the journalists themselves. Now that artist's tongue is firmly in cheek. He's poking fun at this phenomenon. But for me, it raises an interesting and serious question, and that's, how did the conspicuous presence of artists and indeed photographers who we'll come to, how did the presence of these figures in war zones alter the experience of conflict and violence for the combatants involved? If we see here on the left, a front page illustration from the Illustrated London News during the Second Anglo-Afghan War of 1878 to 80. And it's from their man on the spot, William Simpson. And he's advertising here his embedded status on the campaign. He's showing himself, along with two other reporters, Phil Robinson of the Daily Telegraph and Archibald Forbes of the Daily News, all sleeping out in the open on the eve of a military assault. And so they're sort of exposed here to the same conditions as the soldiers whose bodies we can also see sleeping in the background of this image. So the image, the scene, this front page is really embodying, I think, the main conceit of these artistic journalists at this time, and that's that they were thoroughly immersed in the events that they were chronicling. You know, partly this is stuff of just masculinist, imperialist fantasy. And that's what the artist from the Boer War is sort of pointing out. You know, it's ridiculous the extent to which these artists are claiming some kind of bravery and heroism. But I think it points to something real as well. And that's that, you know, this kind of sketching on the spot, reporting in the field, this was not just an impassive record of events by someone standing with sort of Cartesian imperiousness outside of the situation. You know, they're not outside of the situation that they're documenting. They're very much involved. You know, this was a resolutely corporeal practice, and it presented itself as such. I think in the textual and visual narratives of the press that we see emerging at this time, bodily experience like this is tied up with knowledge. It's a form of epistemology, really. You know, it's productive of knowledge about the hardships of campaigning, but it's also performing a certain vision, a certain normative vision of the Victorian military ideal, the Victorian military physique as being able, adaptable, tough. So there's this blurring, really, of the boundaries between the soldier and the journalist in terms of their identity. They're both making claims to the same kind of rugged masculine identity here. But what did these soldiers, the actual soldiers, make of their new bedfellows, the journalists? Well, the people involved in these military campaigns were actually sort of doubly exposed to the imagery of these journalists, because they were consuming the engravings and the prints that would ultimately be published in the press, as we saw in that painting from the Crimean War. You know, they would have those newspapers sent back to them. They would put pictures from those newspapers on the wall. They were consuming the finished product. But at the same time, the people who were actually in those campaigns were watching these artists work. They were watching them create the sketches, and they were also participating in that artistic production. They would pose for them from time to time, and things such as that. And watching this sketch, I think, is particularly important, because the sketch, more so actually than the engravings that we see here, the sketch was what was accumulating a kind of potent symbolism in the minds of the Victorians, a symbolism of this new breed of kind of swashbuckling journalist, but also symbolic of a kind of visual form that was peculiarly good at capturing the texture of experience during warfare. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment, but it's worth recalling here that famous essay, Painter of Modern Life, by the French poet Charles Baudelaire. Art historians in the audience will no doubt be familiar with this, as will many modernists. And in that essay, Baudelaire is sort of rhapsodic about the sketches that were emanating from artists working in the Crimean War. And he saw in these sketches emerging from war zones the contours, really, of a new form of modern art. And like Baudelaire, the British also saw something particularly thrilling in the original sketches that were produced quickly on the spot. You know, the process of wood engraving, via which that sketch would then be redrawn by a different artist, traced out onto a wooden block, and then undergo mass printing. This was a process that meant the actual sort of the original style, should we say, of the artist who produced that image was flattened a little bit into the kind of house style of the newspaper. And sometimes even the content would be significantly changed as well. But the sketch itself, the original visual document, if you like, this was seen to have a kind of aura about it, an aura that seemed to speak to the fraught conditions of its own creation. And because of this, in the autumn of 1870, at the Crystal Palace in Sydenham, and this was actually the new home of that one-time Temple of Peace that had originally stood in Hyde Park, there was, rather ironically, for something that had been a Temple of Peace, an exhibition of 140 wartime sketches produced by men like William Simpson and others, which were on loan from the Illustrated London News and the Graphic. And the accompanying catalogue for this exhibition asserted that they were of far higher interest than many of the more finished productions because they were taken on the spot at the risk of life and limb. A critic for the Times concurred, and he celebrated the ability of the sketches to, I quote, bring us without doubt nearer to the tremendous events they portray. There is something about the rude and hasty scrawl on a crumpled bit of paper, with its terrible dashes for exploding shells and scratches that do duty for outline, that gives us a better idea than did the engravings of the confusion and terror. So we see that the medium itself here, in its fragile materiality and its abbreviated forms, is being seen to speak to the vulnerability of the body and mind in conditions of war. And this is something which is a little bit detectable, I think, in Simpson's Crimean sketchbooks. You see some of that here on the right, which contain these kind of visual meditations on mortality that really undercut the devil-may-care persona that a man like Simpson was promoting, really, in his writings, in his sort of official accounts that he was sending to the press. Graves figure very, very prominently in the sketchbooks, as do dead bodies like this, which are traced by these kind of tremulous pencil lines, which in their very delicacy seem to register something of life's precariousness here. The sketchbooks used by men like Simpson were often no larger than one's hand. They were very small, and when you view them, when you go to the archive and view them, this one is in the Yale Centre for British Art, you really get a sense of this being an apparatus that was intended for flexible and rapid operations. It's part of a kinetic, embodied practice. And I think it's undoubtedly true that artists like Simpson were exaggerating their exploits for effect. But it was also true that what they were doing was dangerous work, and some of them would die doing this. When Simpson was covering the Second Anglo-Afghan War, we saw the front cover of the newspaper for that a little earlier, he reportedly had soldiers pose for him while under fire so that they could make a sketch, or that he could make a sketch, depicting the first shot of the campaign. And you can see the sketch on the left here. So we find in this account that the actual field of battle is being overlaid with this kind of tableau vivant, representing that very same field in a slightly earlier and apparently more newsworthy state of combat. And the resulting print, which we see on the right here, and you can see these kind of subtle changes, it just shows soldiers in a mountainous landscape. The positions of the Afghan army are marked in the background. It's a fairly generalized set of tropes, really. A shadowy enemy, a forbidding terrain, an energetic body of British troops. This is a fairly interchangeable scene in many ways, but it was lifted from the precarious performances of individuals in the field. and their posing bodies were being sort of loaded with political symbolism, standing for abstract qualities like heroism, or sovereignty, imperial sovereignty. And I'm interested really in how these acts of posing shaped the framework, constructed a framework within which danger and violence were experienced for these colonials. The theatricality of the image-making event, I think, was really shaping the meaning of violence. These special correspondents, like William Simpson, they were adept at channeling these experiences of war through fairly heroic narrative frames whose tropes had developed in tandem with the Victorian Imperial adventure novel. And this was a sort of a genre which would produce thousands of really formulaic tales of pluck and daring do and adventure. It gave positive narrative value to what might otherwise have been the disturbing first order experience of being exposed to violence. And William Simpson, the artist, was actually quite explicit that this is what he was doing, that these scenes were scenes of interpolation in which he would sort of bequeath an identity, a favorable identity upon those posing. In his account of doing this, he said, "They were both looking a little scared, and I asked if this was the first time they had been under fire, and they said yes. But these men, while scared, were journalistically literate recruits, and they weather this existential threat," he says, "with the idea that they would appear as heroes in the pages of the Illustrated London News." So in the midst of this kind of potentially overwhelming wartime experience for young, probably teenage recruits, the event of sketching is kind of hailing these figures as conventionalized, heroic figures. But it wasn't just colonials for whom these acts of sketching were kind of creating frameworks for interpreting a situation. They were also zones of encounter between colonizer and colonized, or would-be colonizer at least. Simpson produced numerous portraits of prisoners of war and tribal elders during the Afghan War. And under the watch of the leader of the British expedition, Major Cavagnari, one of these sittings saw its elderly subject regale the colonial pair with his memory of the first Anglo-Afghan War 30 years earlier. You can see the resulting sketch here. And this man said that back then, the British had fought like devils, but they were massacred nevertheless. And Simpson recorded this man's comments on the original sketch. So he's accepting to a certain degree a dialogical process of history making. He's documenting the war on behalf of the British press, but this Afghan man is also displaying a degree of historiographical agency, I think. His oral testimony is serving here as a thinly veiled warning to the British. The Afghan people had already once expelled their European invaders from the very hills in which he was now posing. In sitting for Simpson, he was not just turned into an instrument of colonial narrative. He capitalized on the attention paid him in that moment to remind the British of Afghan fortitude. And as it turned out, this all turned out to be rather grimly prophetic for the British. In 1879, the graphic announced the conclusion of the Anglo-Afghan War, what was thought at the time, at least, to be the conclusion. It turned out not to be. And it ran this front page illustration by their artist on the spot, Frederick Villiers. And it shows the new Emir of Afghanistan, and then peering at his portrait as it emerges from the Nickelodeon glass plate photographic negative. Now, the artist Villiers was a regular correspondent for that popular illustrated magazine, and he was by no means averse to self-promotion. In fact, he loved it. But here, surprisingly, instead of promoting his own practice of sketching in the field, he's sketching the practice of that of what might be seen really as a rival practice, a photographer. And he's doing this, I think, in order to report on the drama of an Asian sovereign posing at this kind of vexed moment of geopolitical transition. I think the scene works particularly well to conflate military conquest and photographic capture. But at the same time, this is a visual narrative when seen across the two scenes, which complicates the comparison of the camera with this kind of triumphant weapon-based metaphor, camera as cannon, camera as dominance. Because instead of featuring as this kind of explosive, dominating, instantaneous force here, we find something significantly more complex. Villiers is highlighting the technical procedures of photography. He's portraying this quite delicate form of visual theatre in which the as yet unfinished photographic negative is becoming an object of cross-cultural spectatorship. So photography is encountered here not as a fully developed positive print, but as something inchoate, something active, an ongoing chemical process. We find a fixing solution being poured over the glass plate negative, and it's running over this nascent image which we can't actually see. The portrait itself is invisible. There's a kind of blind spot at the center of this scene, but it highlights the temporality, the time taken to produce a photograph in a way that I think makes this scene what W.J.T. Mitchell would refer to as a meta picture. It invites viewers to reflect on the nature of image making itself. And photographs were made through a series of theatrical and technical procedures occurring both inside and outside of portable darkrooms. And the darkroom is what you see on the bottom right there. That's not a camera on the bottom right, that's the darkroom. And it involved the preparation, posing, exposure, developing, fixing, rinsing, varnishing the negative, all of which happened, or a lot of which happened sort of outside and within sight of people around. So today we tend to think of photography in terms of instantaneity, in terms of immediacy, as a snapshot. But that was really a late 19th century or later 19th century innovation. For early photographers, it was a complex and lengthy chemical process. And increasingly, the colonial experience of conflict and diplomacy was unfurling in this kind of complex feedback loop with image-making techniques like sketching or like photography. As the critic of the Athenaeum commented, "While the fate of nations is in the balance, we shall hear of the photographer measuring his acids and rubbing his glasses to a polish." So at this fraught moment of geopolitical change, the Emir is caught at the intersection of numerous colonial techniques of observation, sketching, painting, photography, as well as various forms of written report. The key documentation we have of this portrait event, besides the actual images, comes to us by none other than William Simpson, who supplemented his income as an artist by writing written reports for the Daily News, one of which was titled "Photographing the Emir." So we see that these acts of posing, these acts of image making, they were themselves considered to be newsworthy episodes. And the visual archives of the British Empire are really littered with figures like this captured at fraught geopolitical moments. And these figures, I think, they're not only pictorial motifs, these documents are traces of embodied encounters in which technical procedures and aesthetic conventions, whether of sketching or photography, were shaping the experience of conquest. Bodies were harnessed to pose under conditions of really quite significant violence and stress. And they watched as images of themselves were produced under the shadow of conflict, knowing that the resulting print or engraving would ultimately circulate in global networks. So I'm going to move on now to a section of the talk which is going to deal in more depth with photographs, more explicit photographs of violence, and think about how some of the issues which I've raised so far about the sort of the techniques of image making impacted the experience of violence in these instances. You know, the camera and its procedures, I think, were just as much a part of the invasive spectacle of empire as any parading soldiers or envoys were. And we get quite a striking sense of this, I think, in the image that I have up here by John Claude White, which shows the triumphant entry of the Young Husband mission into Lhasa in Tibet in 1904. Young Husband said that every detail, both for effect and for defense, were thought about when he planned this procession into what was called by the British the Forbidden City. And there was a very grave significance of this procession for the Tibetans themselves. And this can be gauged by the fact that Tibetan emissaries had earlier pleaded with the encroaching British embassy. It was called an embassy, by the way. You know, this was conceived in the British mind as a diplomatic expedition, not a military invasion. It was very fluid, the relationship between those two things. Tibetan emissaries had earlier pleaded that this British legation would turn back, and they were claiming that their presence, the British presence in the capital, would ultimately basically spoil the Tibetan religion and threaten the Dalai Lama. But Lhasa was marched upon nevertheless, and it was unveiled, as the British press had it, for the camera on August 1904. John Claude White was the official photographer, and he brought with him 6 cameras and innumerable plates that required 3 mules and a team of Indian assistants. And he used his large and heavy panoramic camera with glass plate negatives to capture this scene. And it's this quite I think we see the extent to which this is really an eye-catching apparatus, because it's been positioned to document the imperial parade from the perspective of the Tibetans. He's sort of embedded himself within the Tibetan crowd. Yet those Tibetan spectators appear less struck by the imperial parade than by the act of photography itself. We find harsh stares from the local congregation here, making for a tense scene in which the viewer is positioned as one among many in a crowd, but without enjoying the kind of anonymity that a crowd usually provides. There's this palpable sense of unease here, and a palpable sense of how conspicuous colonial photography in the field was, and the fact that it's this kind of fraught space of political encounter. And the camera had a clear political symbolism, clear imperial symbolism in the minds of the British. The popular commercial photographer Samuel Bourne was emphatic about its impact. He wrote, "There is scarcely," excuse me, I've got hay fever. Hay fever is terrible here today. As there is now scarcely a nook or corner, a glen, a valley or mountain, much less a country on the face of the globe, which the penetrating eye of the camera has not searched, or where the perfumes of poor archers' clothing, that's a chemical used in photography, have not risen through the hot or freezing atmosphere, photography in India is, least of all, a new thing. From the earliest day of the calotype, the curious tripod, with its mysterious chamber and mouth of brass, taught the natives of this country that their conquerors were the inventors of other instruments, besides the formidable guns of their artillery, which, though as suspicious perhaps in appearance, attained their object with less noise and smoke. So Bourne there is drawing on this very commonplace Victorian equation of the camera and the cannon. And he's seeing the camera as a kind of demonstration of the technological might of the British Empire, the broader technological advances which he sees as emblematic of that empire. And the intended audience of this kind of what is really photographic theatre, really, was not just the British consumers who were ultimately buying Bourne's photographs, buying these prints. It's the inhabitants of the glens and the valleys that Bourne mentions, who may well never see the finished photographs, but were nevertheless exposed to the act of making them, exposed to the apparatus of the camera, the negative, and the sort of the chemicals that went along with that. So my thinking, a lot of the thinking motivating my recent book really was, what does it mean to be posed for the camera in such moments? Once you begin thinking about these images, not merely in terms of pictorial motifs, but as part of the shrapnel of violent geopolitical processes, artifacts of wartime encounters, I think this question becomes quite pressing. And my research has been motivated, in part anyway, by a desire to try and recuperate some aspect of these experiences. But as many post-colonial scholars have noted before me, this kind of recuperative endeavor can be when looking through imperial archives, since many of the colonized figures found therein are what Zeb Tortorici calls indexical absences. An indexical absence is when the kind of existence of someone is attested by the archive, but in a manner that points to a more substantial loss of information about their lives. And in the case of many of these photographs, we have no names for these sitters. We have no testimony from them. They're just darkened forms on fading photographs. As Anjali Arundekar has noted, just because a body is found in the archive of empire does not mean that their subjectivity or history can ever be recovered. I think her procession can be frustratingly on the mark when one confronts the procession of anonymous and shadowy bodies in early colonial war photography in India. So how should we interpret figures like these? Well, I'm an art historian, so what immediately comes to mind is the landscape tradition within European painting. And this is one in which it's fairly common practice to have anonymous and distant figures situated in the scene, part of what was called the staffage of a landscape. And they give that landscape a sense of being a lived-in place, a human environment, and they provide an indication of scale. And they also evoke this idyllic, pastoral, artistic tradition in which the kind of countryside, the rural existence is seen to be this kind of harmonious and romanticized thing. And so in invoking that kind of idea, idyll, I think they might be said to restore or help to restore these landscapes of violence to a sense of calm, a sense of order. This is fundamentally an aesthetic reading, I think, and it feels insufficient to me, particularly when we're engaging with photographs. and therefore engaging with the positioning of flesh and blood bodies on real sites of recent violence. I think the proximity of these figures to these sites raises questions. It raises questions about their political status and their safety under wartime imperial regimes. Take this scene. This is produced in 1858 by an amateur photographer called Dr. John Murray, who lived in Agra. And it's part of an official commission from the East India Company to photograph sites impacted by the Indian uprising that erupted the previous year. Murray was operating within a fierce climate of counterinsurgency warfare in India. It's one in which the British were deploying really quite extraordinary levels of violence against the population in the attempt, which was ultimately successful, to quell the anti-colonial forces that had gathered momentum in the region. Murray left us a diary, which makes him a particularly interesting figure within the history of photography at this time. And in one quite sort of typically laconic diary entry, Murray swings quite dizzyingly, really, from a note about seeing mass public executions to a description of the technical details of making photographs. He says, "There were 87 rebels hung this morning. The last batch of photographic plates turned cloudy and bad from making experiments diminishing the strength of gum and citric acid." So Murray's photographs of bleak and barren war sites, I think, should be seen in relation to the public spectacles of violence that were coming to characterize the Victorian warfare, and what the Victorians themselves would ultimately call savage warfare. And this was a warfare run along the kind of lines of counterinsurgency. And it was a mode of warfare that was seen as distinct from the moral norms governing European conflict. The photographs that Murray went on to publish show the wreckage of this kind of warfare. But unlike special war artists who we've seen, the actual fighting, this is not shown. The camera could not capture fighting at this time. It couldn't capture movement. And there was a sense among the Victorians that the technical limitations of the camera, its long exposure times, the fact that it was so heavy and laborious to lug around. So even, if fighting is happening over there, by the time you get there, it's probably finished. It's almost inherently belated. It meant it was always failing to capture the actual cut and thrust of warfare. And that's one of the reasons the Victorians preferred, in some ways, for journalistic purposes, the artist's pencil. But far from being always underwhelming, photography was also creating these documents of violence that could be really shocking to Victorian sensibilities, and which remain shocking. They're thorny and impactful images, I think, from our post-colonial standpoint. This image contains a kind of atmosphere of violence. There's the prominence of the cannon next to these crouching Indian bodies. And if we turn again to Murray's diaries, we get a sense of the specific conditions under which these men sat for the camera. Shortly after he'd left Calcutta with his government commission, Murray witnessed a military execution. In his diary, he wrote the following: "Saw a mutineer blown away from a gun, took a view, number 18, when they were reading the sentence to him, then got out of the way. The pieces of flesh and bone are scattered all around, and the head goes bounding in front. The body appears to swell and burst like a shell. Death must be instantaneous." So this entry indicates that Murray documented the last traumatic moments of an Indian man's life by taking a photograph, which he calls number 18, while the man was strapped to a cannon prior to being blown away. And execution by cannon was a common occurrence, as I'm sure a lot of people know, during the uprising, and it was quite widely reported in the British press. But Murray's photograph, now which seems to be lost, does not appear to have been included among those he actually sent back to his government employers, or in those he published for public consumption. So there seems to be a decision to self-censor here that suggests that this photograph was not considered appropriate material, really, for official imperial memory. It embodies Anne McClintock's notion of what she calls imperial ghosting, in which the Imperial Archive is structured by these administered forgettings. As one Victorian journalist, noted acidly in response to a later colonial war in Burma, British sensibilities about issues like this were such that they could be shocked at the thought of photographing a batch of men at the moment of their execution, when their execution in batches is simply accepted as an ordinary incident in the subjugation of a conquered people. So there's this reluctance really to fully visually confront violence, which actually is reported in the press, but which has a slightly different tenor to it, I think, when photographed. But in this image, we do have a kind of visual trace, in a way, of the execution event. Murray's diary tells us that this scene of the parade ground was taken shortly after the cannon-based killing. And so here the viewer is invited to draw associations between colonial weaponry and Indian bodies. And as Murray, I think would probably have been Murray's assistants, would probably have witnessed the execution alongside of Murray before posing next to the same type of deadly weaponry. And given the infamously excessive and arbitrary nature of colonial violence during this campaign, I think it's unlikely that the pictured figures felt securely, completely exempt from that kind of mass violence when their own bodies were being used by a colonial photographer to commemorate it. As the Bengali writer Bonlanath Chanda recalled shortly after the war, it mattered little who the redcoats killed. The innocent and the guilty, the loyal and the disloyal, the well-wisher and the traitor were confounded in one promiscuous vengeance. The diary entry. Perhaps the most well-known photograph of violence to emerge from this war was Felice Beato's shocking record of a massacre in Lucknow. You see this horrific explosion of bones dominating the foreground of the scene. Such a sight of slaughter I never saw, wrote a colonial soldier. Rebels were shot down and bayoneted in heaps, 3 or 4 feet deep. In this photograph, we appear to find the remains of these heaps, as if the victors had left the dead to decompose wherever they had fallen. But this was not, in fact, the case. By the time that Beato arrived at this location in March, the bodies had been buried in a mass grave. The photographer arranged for their exhumation in order to make his photograph. He created what Christopher Pinney has called a complex reanimation of the uprising as a theatrical spectacle. An Italian-British commercial photographer, Beato had worked in partnership with James Robertson in the Crimean War, but he only began producing explicit photographs of death like this upon leaving Europe and venturing into the relative anomie of colonial conflict. The imagery was considered distasteful by some of the colonials who saw it, or at least who saw the means by which he produced it. Disinterring the dead, in one case running up to a gallows immediately after a hanging in order to steady swinging bodies for the camera, and even reportedly at one time exclaiming that a scene of dead and dying that he was about to photograph was beautiful, Dragging the skeletons of battle back into the light of day for the camera like this created a sepulchral framework for these posing men. The figures are arranged like so many more bones, forging a threatening equivalence between living figures and cadaverous props. Each is turned into a type of pictorial fodder. Recall again Chanda's words that Indian innocence and guilt were of no great significance in determining who was vulnerable to colonial violence during this war, that all Indian men were liable to become confounded in one promiscuous vengeance. So the positioning of these figures, proximity to dead compatriots, frames them, I think, as what Judith Butler has called precarious life, a politically induced condition in which certain populations become differentially exposed to injury, violence, and death. These are not just documents of war, neatly separable from the violence that they record. As one soldier wrote of Beato's photographic interventions, they brought additional horrors to the event. So we see that the visitors staring at sort of weaponry at the military court of 1862, here on the right, in this strange temple that's been built out of rifles. They arrived at this display as a very different kind of spectator from the crowds who had first admired global art and industry at the Temple of Peace at the Great Exhibition 10 years earlier. The guns on display at the 1862 World's Fair were symptomatic of a broader militarization of Victorian culture, spurred by the violent crises of maintaining a global empire and amplified by new communication technologies. The Crimean War and the Indian Uprising were shortly followed by war in China, Afghanistan, and Burma. The list of British imperial conflicts goes on, amounting to what Dan Hicks here in Oxford at the Pitt Rivers Museum has termed World War Zero. Far from being ignored, imperial conflicts became unprecedentedly visible in the visual culture of Victorian society. And I think that any account of the colonial experience in this period is incomplete without understanding something of the nature of this international traffic in violent imagery. Thank you for listening. I'm keen to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Sean, for giving us a glimpse, for drawing us into your wonderful work, into the charged political, active, precarious, and violent world and ethos that artists and photographers and other actors inhabited, confronted, engaged, and visually projected in the British colonial period. It's such a great opportunity for all of us to engage with your scholarship here, and I know that many of us here have also benefited immensely from your work. So thank you, Sean, and thank you, Bangalore International Center, for putting together this discussion. Let me begin by asking you, Sean, how you became interested in this subject of documenting, of writing about, of understanding moments of rupture in the picturesque. What drew you into this particular field, and what were and are some of the questions that you had and continue to have when one thinks of popular constructs, histories, perceptions of photography and art in colonial India, in South Asia, and elsewhere in the colonial world, that continue to percolate in some ways today? And if I can add, because I think that what's happening today is that a certain kind of imagery and discourse has been circulating in the public domain, whether of colonial or post-colonial images, that one typically, talks about nostalgia, a kind of pristine modernity, nationhood, nationalism in its many forms, violence, and in that process, things continue to get glossed over, brushed aside, and coded into similar terms such as war and peace. And of course, there's, there's a market, there's active consumption and propaganda. And this new, and the Victorian modern subject that you brought together, talked about in your presentation, is continued to be made and molded. So my question is, how did you get interested in your work, and why do you think such a conversation on visual technologies and imperial violence is important in the present day?
Thank you. Well, so I suppose in the initial instance, I was rather interested in this because when, as an undergraduate, I had read Edward Said's Orientalism for a Theory and Methodology course. It was one of those texts that was just blew me away when I read it, and it just felt deeply insightful and important to me. And I wanted very much to be able to continue the kind of work that Said had put into effect with that book. And so when I came to do my MA, there was a module run by Sarah Monks, actually, which looked, and I think it was really quite ahead of its time in terms of teaching the art history of empire, because this was some years ago now, and it's still rare that one would find a module like this. But it was looking at art and empire in India from the early 18th century through to the 20th, and so that's one of the modules that I took, and I just was fascinated by the scholarship that there was, but also quite excited as somebody who had a PhD on his mind and further study on his mind that actually one could see quite a lot that hadn't been done, and it felt like it was material that had been overlooked, but which was actually, I think, deeply important to look at, and that the overlooking of some of this material was politically charged, and in some ways repeated the operations of the Victorians themselves. So, for instance, some of the images that I look at here, the more violent ones, and that there are others in the book. I don't like to include them unless I have time to talk extensively about them in the presentation. I feel uncomfortable including them just as illustrations to sort of quickly run through. But there are more in the book, and these are scenes which the archives that hold them, don't particularly promote their existence. And for instance, the National Army Museum, which holds some of these, has a web page, public web page called "Why Did the Indian Mutiny Happen?" And it's got lots of illustrations, and the illustrations are all by a special artist, Atkinson, and they're quite cartoonish, really. They make the war look like a comic book. And there's a kind of humorous quality to them. And it was interesting to me that these were the images that had been chosen from the archive in order to speak seriously about warfare, because they made the violence feel much more distant, I think, less threatening, less disturbing than would have been the case if they had highlighted some of their other imagery. And of course, there's all kinds of considerations which a museum like that has to take into account about putting imagery like that on a public web page. I'm not really sort of heavily criticizing them for it here, but it is interesting, these decisions which are made, which mean that this imagery is not well known. And for instance, when I gave a talk like this in Oxford recently, and a colleague who works on 1857 as a historian rather than an art historian, she said, she was surprised that she wasn't familiar with some of the images that I had been showing, and I think that it's, you know, there is a reason to look at this kind of material, because as you were so eloquently saying there, you know, we're still living through, I mean, particularly in Britain, I know less about how it is in other European countries, but particularly in Britain, our vision of what the empire was is still completely structured by the PR that was put out really in the Victorian era about what the empire was and why it was a good thing and why it did more good than bad. And when you speak to most sort of, maybe not, when you speak to a lot of people about the British Empire, firstly, it's striking how little they know about it. It's not taught in schools. And what they do know about it are these sorts of talking points. They'll say something about railways. Didn't we build railways? And they'll say something about promoting democracy and ending slavery. And these are the three things that people seem to, or think that they know about the British Empire, and everything else sort of fades into the background. So I think there's a lot of work still to be done in terms of public understanding in Britain of what the empire was and what it meant for the populations that endured it, but also for British colonials themselves. So that's what sort of drew me in, I suppose, and kept me going across the years of the project.
Thank you. I mean, it kind of ties in really well to my next question as you bring up the question of PR machinery, propaganda, and this sort of aesthetic and political remove in cartoons, political cartoons that we talked about. My next question, touches upon Ahmad Ali Khan, the photographer and architect, and how we think of the making of the native artist, photographer, schools, art schools that were set up to train and sort of correct native mental and aesthetic faculties. And in that sense, the way you sort of excavate the role that Ahmad Ali Khan plays as both a photographer, as a subversive figure in colonial Lucknow, quite in contrast to figures, colonial photographers that you talked about, such as Felice Beato and John Murray. Colonial photographers, on the one hand, who were, actively participating in the field, in propagating violence in their own way. They weren't mere documentarians. And also, on the other hand, somebody possibly less threatening, like Raja Deen Dayal. So my question is, how photography becomes both a cure and poison. The role of a native photographer like Ahmad Ali Khan, and what happened, say, to the Photographic Society of Bengal in another story. Could you tell us a little bit about how the British responded to Ahmad Ali Khan? Because he was not just merely photographing British colonials. He was quite active. He had a certain attitude about himself.
Yes. So the terms you used there, cure and poison, were used by Chris Pinney in his scholarship, and he was sort of drawing on Derrida, but to characterize the British perception of photography in India in the 19th and 20th centuries. And without Chris Pinney's scholarship, I think my book couldn't really have happened. I think it's excellent. One of the things that I sought to sort of build on was his perception that in the 19th century, broadly speaking, photography is seen as a cure by the British, which is to say it's viewed as being something which is good for the empire. And in the 20th century, it's viewed as a poison, something bad for the empire. And this is because technological developments in photography mean that the camera becomes more widespread, more easily used by larger elements of the population, and therefore used in anti-colonial ways in association with Indian independence movements and things like that. And most scholars who have written on the 19th century, on photography in 19th century India, have seen photography in those terms, and it's broadly true. It is broadly true, but it's why I found it particularly interesting to explore the figure of Ahmad Ali Khan in Lucknow, because there are rumors in the colonial press that emerge around this figure during the war. He had been quite popular in Lucknow with the British prior to the war. You know, he was a sophisticated, gentlemanly, intelligent man. And he was one of the only people who could take photographs, and he would take photographs of colonials, and he produced something which has subsequently been called the Lucknow Album, which has lots of pictures of colonials and buildings in Lucknow. And this album is actually found in the aftermath of the Lucknow siege by the British, and they add these handwritten captions to the photographs because many of the people who had been photographed had been killed in that siege. So it's seen in these kind of really kind of melancholy, mournful terms. But interestingly, it's said in the British press that Ahmad Ali Khan had joined the rebels and had become quite prominent there, and had been using photography to take photographs of the Lucknow residency inside of which the British were besieged. And that these photographs were being used by Indian fighters to help them target areas in the buildings. So this is quite a sophisticated form of photographic reconnaissance, and it's something which the British themselves don't really seem to have been doing. They talk a little bit about wanting to do it, but there's no indication that they actually were doing it. So it's this very sophisticated deployment of photography by an Indian photographer. And it's a deployment which has this anti-colonial, counter-insurgent, not counter-insurgent, rather, sorry, insurgent edge to it. And this is interesting in itself, but what I think makes it all the more significant is what it tells us about the fragility, really, of some of the seemingly confident British assertions that were so often made around this time that that Indian people were incompetent and unable to understand the kind of representation that one sees in a photograph without being taught how to through colonial art schools. So you have these colonial art schools being developed, which is supposed to teach students the linear perspective and these kinds of European principles of art and perception. And without this, it's said anyway that the Indian people are completely unable to interpret Western style images, including and especially photographs, to the extent where when it's suggested, for instance, that the colonial police start taking photographs of convicts, the idea is dismissed in the 1860s on the basis of the fact that the Indian policemen would supposedly be unable to recognize anybody from a photograph anyway, because they can't read photographs. So this seems like quite a sort of confident supremacist narrative, and yet it's so vulnerable to just instant collapse under these transformed conditions of the uprising, because suddenly they're extremely worried about a photographer who they see as being actually really quite capable of taking photographs and interpreting them in a way which enables him to be really quite lethal and dangerous to the empire. So I found that story quite quite compelling, both in terms of the literal violence that photography, anti-colonial violence, which photography was facilitating, but also the way that it was challenging colonial epistemological hierarchies which had been put in place. In many ways, it was a difficult chapter to write because it's based on these bits and pieces of rumor here and there in the press that I've tried to sort of weave into a narrative. But I think rumor was such a core element of how information was shared in the revolt and how people experienced it. So even though I've been unable to verify whether this really happened, whether I mean he's a real historical figure, but whether he was actually taking photographs and they were of the besieged building, and whether those photographs were being used by fighters to help them target, I don't know. We haven't been able to sort of unearth that imagery or anything that verifies it. But I think it's interesting, nevertheless, that these rumors were widespread and these rumors were structuring the British perspective of the agency of photography within the war.
I'd like to draw your attention to another album that you talked about, the Tresidder album, and questions of hierarchy that you just brought up. And this was composed after the insurgency. So, and upon his, when Tresidder returns to Kanpur, and there's a sort of, terms such as multiracial, imperial belonging, and again, you bring up Pinney's idea of a common epistemological space. Could you give us a sense of what some of these social and aesthetic dynamics and complexities in the Tresidder album, who he was, particularly in the photographs of the colonial survivor Mowbray Thompson, the rebel Gangu Mehtar, and the supposed informer spy Nana Narayan Rao? There's this sort of question of surveillance shifts in a way. Ahmad Ali Khan earlier used photography to sort of surveil how insurgents could, find an active inroad into fighting back. But then after 1857, there's a different sort of consolidation of power, then a heightened surveillance. Colonial photography, as you write, categorized colonial subjects into three different categories. One is anthropological specimens, the second is suspected insurgents, and the third is potential imperial citizens. And thereby sort of revealing and underlying anxiety and unknowability of the colony in a way.
Mm-hmm. So I'll say a little bit about Tresidder himself. I mean, this album is so interesting because there aren't many albums, personal albums like this. This one in the Arkazi museum archive in Delhi is just, it's sort of a gold mine for a historian of photography. It's so interesting because it shows photography being used in a post-war context in Cawnpore in the 1850s and 60s. But Tresidder himself is a really interesting figure because he was the doctor in Cawnpore before the war, and his wife dies, and he takes leave basically, and he goes back to Britain, where he remarries. But during that time, quite a short amount of time, the uprising occurs, and so by the time he gets back to Cawnpore, the infamous Cawnpore siege and massacre have occurred, and almost everybody that he knew has been killed, barring a one or two, really. And so it's this incredibly traumatizing, I suppose, experience for Tresidder to return to this utterly transformed landscape. And I try to be sensitive to two things. One, that he is a colonizer and involved with forms of post-conflict colonial suppression, but also that he had lived in Cawnpore and considered it to be his home, and so he had attachments there. And so how was he forming those or reforming those attachments through photography? And he's a fascinating figure because Cawnpore is one of those places that sends the British kind of mad in terms of their violent fantasies, which are kind of almost genocidal at times. And yet, and it's something that I've written about in the context of war memorials. That's not so much in the book, but it's one of my articles, that war memorials were tied up with this sort of rhetoric of violent vengeance against the Indian population. But Tresidder has elements of this, but at the same time, he's trying to construct a more positive and viable vision of what the empire could be. And it's a liberal vision, really, where race is not the primary means through which people are categorized. People are categorized according to their sort of participation within civic institutions and within the kind of colonial regime. So it's a more liberal and idealized vision of what the empire could be, a kind of hegemonic vision of the empire as being an empire via consent, rather than empire without, dominance without hegemony, as it's called, in which the British had to rely on the kind of force which they adopted in 1857. And so he uses the camera to take photographs of basically all of the residents of Cawnpore, or all of the kind of middle class residents of Cawnpore anyway, both British and Indian. And he structures it in the album in such a way as to suggest a certain parity between those groups. But it's a parity that can only be pushed so far, because one of the really striking things about the album is that you see this clear desire from Tresidder manifested visually for a kind of this kind of liberal mode of imperial governance. And on the other hand, you also have this intense kind of paranoia evident there about who is an insurgent, who is a potential insurgent. And ultimately, in one of the pages, there's this fascinating composite photograph of all of the white figures from Cawnpore. And outside of this composite depiction of colonial whiteness are certain loyal Indian figures who, in spite of their loyalty or perceived loyalty within the imperial mind, are nevertheless sort of expelled from the true unity, which is still racially marked. So it's this really kind of schizophrenic album. It's trying to do these different things at different times, and I think it speaks to the ambivalence of the colonial mindset in the years after the uprising, as they tried to kind of navigate these landscapes that had become testaments to a kind of what had previously been unthinkable levels of interracial violence.
Thank you for giving us a sense of colonial vulnerability and, how colonials responded and made sense of the landscape post 1857. I think this will be my last question, and I'd like to ask you about the politics of color, and this also ties in with your previous response on and on how colonials contended with their sort of messy geopolitical terrain and how they had to sort of negotiate with different princely kingdoms in India. The painting, the work that I'm talking about is Valentine Princep's the Imperial assemblage. And as you write, how compositional disorder in the image, because the image met with a lot of sort of responses and not favorable responses, and how this compositional disorder could imply political disorder and turbulence, as you write. And much of this has to do with, the role of portraiture and the question of corruption and earlier forms of gifting that were frowned upon, and how Indian rulers also sort of, despite them being part of this multiracial imperial belonging, redefined image production and in their own individual portraits by Princep or other artists. And I'd like to tie this in with, treaty paintings, the genre of treaty paintings and what they reveal and obscure when we think of diplomacy and, as you write, replace conflict with a visual grammar of accord. And, the paintings that come to mind, which you discuss, are, Tipu Sultan's sons being handed over or taken away, Robert Clive and Mir Jafar after the Battle of Plassey, and of Shah Alam. There's a kind of tremendous violence and tragedy that's being painted over in these works, and that these works so deeply resonate with images of treaties and agreements today. Yeah.
Well, I thought it was important in the account that I was giving of the visual culture of empire in this period to think not just of the visual culture of warfare as a visual culture of violence, specifically literal violence, but also to look at the Victorian self perception as an inherently peaceful empire. The Victorians very much saw themselves as a peaceful nation who just happened to constantly be caught up in all of these wars, and the way that they promoted themselves to themselves and others as purveyors of peace was partly through the kind of international exhibitions, which I mentioned in my talk, but it was also through history paintings, which, as you've noted, would highlight things like treaty signings, and would highlight things like that. The sitting that I showed at the end of the Anglo-Afghan War during the talk, where the Emir of Afghanistan is sitting for a colonial photographer. It's not showing the violence that led to that at that time. It's showing the empire as being kind of consensual, being a legal, treaty-bound enterprise. And the sort of epitome of this was the painting that you mentioned at the beginning by Valentine Princep. And if you haven't seen this, I would, Google it. It's Val Princep, the Imperial assemblage. You will get no real sense of it on the screen because it's vast. I think it's like 27 feet long. It's absolutely vast, and it shows the announcement of Queen Victoria as Empress of India in 1877, and numerous Maharajas, etc., around the amphitheatre watching this spectacle. And in order to produce this really weird painting, Princep, ambitious painting, Princep traveled to India, and he had to go to many states which were not under direct imperial control, but which were under the control of the Indian rulers who ruled them. And so he was put in this strange position where he's supposed to be this kind of representative of colonial power, representative of the Empress, Queen Victoria. But he actually doesn't have that much power in the situations that he's put in. And a lot of these Maharajas take advantage of that, and they will delay having their portrait sittings with him for hours or days. They'll fidget during the session so that he can't paint them properly. Sometimes they'll just not turn up for sessions altogether. They won't give him a room to paint in, or they'll give him a really cramped space to paint in. You know, all of these subtle ways of just sort of insulting Princep, and it's a kind of way of asserting their own sovereign autonomy, I think, or at least semi-autonomy within their kingdoms. So he accumulates all of these different portrait studies, some of which are basically only half or quarter finished because they simply wouldn't let him get much further with them. And he collates it into this massive group portrait, which, when it's exhibited at the Royal Academy in 1880, critics pretty much universally just pan it. They hate it. And they describe it in terms of actually launching a violent attack on the eye of the spectator. So it's seen in terms of this kind of unruliness, seen in terms of this almost like a visual insurgency of color. And one New York critic actually makes the joke that perhaps the rulers of India were so annoyed at being made to help finance the production of this painting for the new empress that they've conspired to create such a terrible picture and basically injure British spectators. So it's almost seen as a form of revenge, which is really interesting. But some of the other comments about the picture really hammer home the fact that its failure is perceived not just as an aesthetic failure, but as a failure, a political failure, a failure of political imagination to be able to kind of conceive of this multicultural empire as having any kind of coherence to it. It's seen as just being a mess. And because the Victorians, particularly after 1857, had invested quite a lot really in the notion of the empire as a form of visual spectacle. You know, Lord Lytton, the viceroy at the time of the assemblage, said that the importance of a bit of bunting is ever greater the further east you go. You know, he really sees these sorts of spectacles as being fundamental to the success of the empire, or at least the perceived success of it. Given all of that, the aesthetic failure of a painting like this, which was an official painting, an official commission from the Imperial government, the biggest one for given to a painter, I think, in across those decades, you know, it's not insignificant. It tells us, I think, a lot about some of the inconsistencies in the way that the British were able to conceptualize their rule.
Thank you for giving us a glimpse into a kind of imperial anxiety and, you know, moments of resistance and sort of defiance in a way. I'd like to sort of ask you my last question, which is, we're all very curious and excited about what you are working on now, and if you can sort of give us a small glimpse into that.
It's always a very daunting thing beginning new projects after an old one, but I'm looking still at the relationship of memory and violence in the Victorian era, and I'm particularly interested in how we continue to remember not just colonial violence, but episodes of extraordinary violence from the Victorian period across the decades since then. So not just how the Victorians themselves perceived it, but how we've continued to use imagery to form the public memory of Victorian violence. And this is ranging from looking at the Whitechapel murders, Jack the Ripper murders as they were called, to thinking about how violence in the scramble for Africa was portrayed at the time, and how certain visions of that, like the film Zulu, for instance, have really created this intractable perception of what the empire meant for generations of post colonial Britons. We've got so many memorials, sculptures, public monuments around the UK which have explicit or implicit imperial connotations, and they're very little understood, I think, the way that this form of empire still haunts our material environment, and structures perhaps our public perceptions of history in ways that we don't even always fully appreciate. So that's one of the things that I'm working on, and I have various other projects as well.
Thank you. I know that all of us, and especially me, are looking forward to engaging with your way in one way or the other, and to continuing sort of to engage and converse with questions of colonialism and post-colonialism. So thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your work.
It's been my pleasure.
I'll read out the first and second questions really quickly. This is by Dr. Haq Khan, who says that visual culture has been an essential and integral part of the machinery of British Empire. Kindly tell us about the reason of its importance and prominence. And I think that is something that you've tried to articulate so wonderfully in your presentation. And I'll go to the second question by Siddhanta Goswami, who says that since invention of a state is understood as one of the foremost inventions of colonial modernity, that of a hegemony, how did the first phase of the colonial hegemony, say the phase of the East India Company, transfiguring into British government, ideate photography in relation with a state and was used an apparatus to power their hegemony? John, if you'd like to.
So it's a very good question. So I'd say firstly, the transfer of power from the East India Company to the to it being seen as an actual possession of the crown, it occurs following 1857. It happens in 1858, and it's really used to address the perceived failures of the East India Company, which was seen as perhaps being a little bit rapacious, but more importantly, really from the British perspective, is that it just simply hadn't seen the unrest coming. It hadn't anticipated it, didn't deal with it terribly well. And the East India Company, since its inception, had long been in a kind of antagonistic relationship at times with the British state, because it would because of its practices and because of its debt, and because of its power. So it was a good time to make that transition from East India Company to sort of formal British rule, which I think maybe is perhaps what you're getting at when you're talking about statehood and hegemony. The means through which hegemony was achieved by the British were, I mean, just multifarious. The colonial art schools that I mentioned are one way in which that happened. Other forms of schooling which went along the kind of Anglicization line, which Macaulay had famously called for in the 1830s, that wanted to transform a section of the Indian elite into a kind of middle way between the British and the Indian people, a kind of a means of translating Indian powers, a section of the Indian population who would share sentiments with the British. And a big way that this was sort of promoted was through those world fairs that I mentioned, international exhibitions, which were held not only in London and other British cities, but were held throughout India and throughout the empire, particularly places like Australia. And these were seen as Hoffenberg has written, these were seen as a way of kind of promoting the imperial federation, where vision itself and the shared experience, the shared visual experience of the shows is seen as standing for the unification of the empire. But I think it's important to note, and it's one of the things that I try to engage with a little bit in the book, that kind of formal empire only applies in certain instances. That's the vision that we're given by Walter Crane's map, for instance, where the delineation between the empire and not the empire is seemingly very clear. But in reality, this isn't the case. In reality, places like Afghanistan, Burma, until it's actually, properly colonized, and various other places occupy this kind of liminal ground between colony and not colony, as did many of the Indian states at the time, which were not part of formal British-run territory, but were subject to what was called British paramountcy. So they had no control over foreign policy, for instance, things like that, as Afghanistan did not, briefly following anyway the Second Anglo-Afghan War. So there are all of these gradations actually of sovereignty and of colonial power, which I don't think are always fully appreciated or fully taken into account when we talk about empire. And it's one of the ways actually that I think public understanding has become, in Britain, has become what would you say, sort of skewed. It's that actually India is seen as being the representative of what the British Empire was and what it meant. And India is what people are thinking about when they say, oh, but railways. And they don't say, oh, but suppression of the mutiny, but they say, oh, but railways. And they don't think necessarily about these punitive expeditions that were happening across borders. They don't think necessarily of what was going on in Africa. It's very selective, the perception of empire. So hegemony is an important, is very important, but it's one of those things that is perhaps more operative in certain territories than in others, where actually sort of brief moments of violence, like Abyssinia, for instance, the punitive expedition there, that is the plan, and it doesn't become a formal colony, and the hegemony, getting the people on side, the civilizing mission, these are all much less a part of some forms of colonial violence than others.
Thank you, Sean, for this fascinating presentation and walking us through these multifaceted lives, public and political, of the Victorian imagery that has captured so much of our imagination. At least if I can speak for myself, I can say that undoubtedly. Thank you, Ayesha, for being such an involved interlocutor, and looking forward to more such valuable sharing sessions. Thank you, audiences, for being here. And all I have to say now is good night and see you all next time.
Thank you for having me.